So good day everyone. We are here again to learn another concept of the teaching of science. And don't forget to bring with you your pens and notes and jot down some important information you will get with this lesson. So, let's start. We will tackle about the science process. The science process, which emphasis on skills and the science process. Before we go on to the science process, let us learn what are the goals of science teaching. We have three goals of science teaching. First is to develop the students' competence. To develop the students' competence in searching for knowledge and information in the use of a number of basic as well as integrated science processes. Next is to acquire the skill. To acquire the skill in developing the scientific method. And third is to arouse and sustain. To arouse and sustain interest in the future science-based pursuits. So we now have the science process. So these four are the basic science processes. These basic science processes usually used in elementary grade students. The first process is observing. Observing. So, observing is a process wherein we react by using our five senses. So, what are these five senses? This is the sight, the hearing, the smelling, tasting, and touch. Second is the comparing. So, comparing is the ability to recognize the similarities of differences of things being observed. The third is the classifying. So, classifying is a process of grouping or sorting out number or objects according to observed characteristic they process. And these characteristics serve as the criteria in classifying them. Then next, the fourth basic science processes is the measuring. And this measuring is the process of comparing an unknown quantity to a standard. And the fourth basic science process is measuring. So, measuring is the process of comparing an unknown quantity to a standard. To indicate length, width, and area, a standard called unit is used, which is a meter or a centimeter. So, we have the four basic science processes. First is the observing, second is the comparing, third is the classifying, and fourth is the measuring. And these science processes were basically used in elementary grade students. Next is the integrated science processes. These science processes are used now in a high school level, in a higher level. So first, we have the inferring. Second is the predicting. Third is the controlling variables. Fourth is the interpreting data. So first, we have the inferring. So what is this inferring? So since it is higher order thinking skills, so inferring to state an idea which is based on observation. So ganina, we have the observing, ang first sa basic skill. So now, sa integrated science process, we have this inferring to state idea based on our observation. So observation that is based on our five senses. So an inference is an interpretation or a tentative conclusion based on our observations. Then, it may take the form of a judgment or evaluation. So next integrated science process is the predicting. So what is this predicting? It is the process of making a forecast based on observed events. And we make predictions based on the past and present observations. Next is the controlling the variables. So, controlling the variables, the factor, what is these variables? It is the factor or condition that affect of which is being tested, or the factor or condition the effect of which is being tested. So the variables in an experiment are classified into three. First is the manipulated. So manipulated variable are the factor being changed or varied since it is manipulated. So ang people nga nag-observe manipulated the variables. So either that person changed or varied that variable. Next, classification of a variable is a constant. So this constant, the variable kept unchanged. So untouched ang next na classification sa variables, which is the constant. Next is the responding. So this responding variable is the resulting variable or condition. And the fourth integrated science process is the interpreting the data. So since we have already controlled the variables, so we now interpret the data. So this data collected from a variable in an experiment should be analyzed thoroughly in order to arrive at a clear and reliable conclusion. So that's how we interpret the data after we had controlled the variables. So the last integrated science process is drawing conclusions and generalization. So, drawing conclusions and generalization is the ability to recognize the similarities and differences of things being observed. So, we'll now tackle more about the science processes. So, first with the basic process, which is the observing. So, as we have known in the earlier slides, that observing is a process where we interact with our five senses. So I remember this when I was in grade 3, that our topic was about the leaves. So our teacher grouped us into 5, and then as a group we roam around the campus and find and collect those leaves. So through observing, we now describe the different shapes, the different colors of the leaves, and then it is important to develop the skill observing. So how to develop the skill of observing? To first make use that the students are required to use several, if not all, the 5 senses. So for example, like my example kanina, that our teacher instruct us to collect different leaves, and then from that collection, from our activity, we use our sense of seeing, touching, and other senses. So although not all senses have been used, but we make use of several senses. And then second is include observation of things that are moving or objects that are likely to produce the changes. And then third is to use materials and objects with different characteristics. So diba, like for example, sa kato akong example kanina, that kanang we collect different kinds of leaves. So with that leaves has different characteristics. They have different colors, they have different shapes and different textures. So that use materials and objects with different characteristics. So the fourth step on how to develop the skill of observing is allow the students to use the numerical description. So for example, sa leaves, Of course, we have different shape and the different there are na yung mga leaves that in one stalk they have different numbers. So for allow them to use the numerical description. So that teacher allows us to describe that leaves. For example, how many leaves in one stalk. So that's it. That's for the fourth um the fourth So that's it. So that's for the fourth step of how to develop the skill of observing, which is allow the students to use numerical descriptions. So fifth is to plan lessons where they have observed things and events. And last is to stick to statements about what they have observed. So dili ka pwede nga you will make another statement that is not based on what they have observed. So because the students might be confused. So since we now know about on how to develop the skill of observing to the students, so what are the advantages in developing the skill? Developing the skill of observing. So first, the students become keen in gathering information through the use of the senses. So they now aware na sila that through using our five senses, we can observe different things. We can describe the different characteristics of these things. Second advantage in developing the skill is that the observations they gather will be real, of course, since they have observed it. So the informations they gather i- are will become real. And then third is that they are more competent in answering or solving problems, situations, rather than depend on hearsays and untested solutions. So, di ba, dili sila mo depend sa mga fake news. Since they know that through observing, they will know they will gather the real information. So now will be they will be more competent in answering or solving problem situation that is based on their observation. So the fourth advantage in developing the skills is that the students will have will constantly use the senses. So di ba, they learn in the school that through using your five senses, you can describe this thing. So when at home, they can use that knowledge that through observation with your five senses you can describe different things at your home. And then the fifth advantage in developing the skill is that they will develop a scientific mind. Next basic science process is the comparing. So, why is comparing considered as a science process? Yeah, di ba? We have this comparison in English. So, why comparing is also considered as a science process? So, first, it is in itself a method or a system by which the observations could be adjudged reliable and accurate. So, from my example kanina that ang isa ka bata will describe this leaves, the color of the leaves as green. So another child will describe the color of the leaves as a yellow. So then it is a method of comparing. So it is itself a method of or a system by which the observations could be adjudged reliable and accurate. So they now have to conclude that ang leaves kay di lang siya green. There are also leaves nga yellow or other colors that they can see. So second is that it is based on some observable characteristics of the objects being compared. Yes, since sa observation, so based ang comparing man jud nganong science process siya is sa ilahang na-observe, 'di ba? Through observation they will use their five senses. So ilang pag-observe, for example sa leaves. Sa ilang pag-observe nakita nila nga ang uban leaves green, ang uban leaves brown, ang uban leaves yellow. So through that makita nila nga ang description dahil sa leaves, ang comparison sa description sa leaves kay observable characteristics lang of that objects of that leaves. So the third is the comparison is objective. Only what is seen or heard and not what they think it is. So, di ba sa science, we have facts and our definition should be objective. It is based on what we have seen or heard or what we have observed through our five senses. Dili siya pwede na it is based on our opinion or what we think it is. So that is why comparing is considered as a science process. So comparing, as we have done in the previous slides, is the ability to recognize the similarities and differences. So how to develop the skill of comparing? So first is to include the materials with varied features so as to sharpen their ability to do the same. So, for example, sa katong leaves, so di ba, laylay siya. So, for example, sa color lang, laylay siya color na ay yellow, na ay green, na ay brown, and other colors. So, that material alone have varied features. Then, next is to refrain from pointing to the property to be examined. So, like what our teacher did, so she let us roam in the campus and collect different kinds of leaves. So, she said na different kind of leaves. Wala lang niya gi-point nga dito nga leaves, mao to siyang inyo i-collect. So, she let us roam around and collect different kinds. And by that, we have collected different kinds and we have learned that there are different characteristics of the leaves. So, and the fourth is the comparison can be recorded in the form of tabulation, graphs, or colored illustration for easy interpretation. So, after that collection of leaves, we now draw, since elementary, so we draw and color through crayons the different characteristics of leaves. So what are the advantages in developing the skill of comparing? So first is that it enables the students to analyze the information gathered by observing accurately and honestly. Yes. And then, since comparison, it is in care in comparing guarantees precision and authenticity. So, diba, since comparing, naging mga little details nga atong i-include nga mga changes sa iyang mga characteristics. So, it is authentic and it is precise. And then, third is it enables the students to evaluate evidence whether to accept or reject them before formulating a conclusion. So, diba, to evaluate their evidence, for example, sa leaves, sakto ba jud nga yellow kung ibutang? Yellow ba gid ni siya nga color? Nga na sila. Since it is a comparison, diba? So, it enables them to evaluate evidence if it should be accepted or rejected before formulating their conclusion. And then, fourth is that they become wise decision maker. Diba kay i-compare nila, sakto ba to, kung buhaton ko ni, mao ba gid ang insakto nga outcome. So, through the skill, through the knowledge of, through having the skill of comparing, then it enables them to become a good decision maker, a wise decision maker. And fifth is an objective comparison. An objective comparison facilitates accurate interpretation of data. Yes, diba? Since for comparing is to be considered as a science process, the comparison should be objective at not subjective. So, this objective comparison, di ba, observable man siya. So, it facilitates the accurate interpretation of data since we can observe those accurate siya nga mga details, mga characteristics. So, that were some of the advantages in developing the skill of comparing. So we will go into the next basic science process, which is the classifying. So classifying is a process of grouping or sorting out the number of objects according to observable characteristics they possess. So how we should develop the skills of classifying. So first, to start by requiring the students to classify their things at home. So, di ba, i-classify na to. Sa at home, so kuni siya, i-classify nimo ang mga utensils. I-classify nimo ang shape sa plato, i-classify nimo ang everything that can be seen at home. So, kadapat simple lang since kani nga mga basic kani nga mga science process can be usually used in elementary students. So second is a student can classify a number of objects if he or she discovers the characteristics, the property or quality of the objects where the classification can be based. So for example, sa katong leaves. So the students will classify sa shape, sa color, based on the shape, based on the color, based on a number sa leaves within the stalk. So, since they know unsa nga mga classification, unsa nga mga characteristics, properties or quality of the objects that they will be classified, so they can classify that object. They can classify now the leaves. Its different characteristics. So third is to expose them in the learning area in the school. So as what that teacher our teacher in grade 3 do. So i-expose me niyas outside the school but inside the premises of the campus. So expose them. We learn that we learn through observation in the campus. We learn through the observation in nature. So, fourth is go out of the classroom and observe how things are classified in nature. So, that's it. So, we go out to the campus to collect the different kinds of leaves. Sa iyahang color, sa iyahang shape, sa iyahang texture, and other things. And then, fifth is to use only one characteristic at time in classifying things to avoid confusion. So, yes, to one step at a time. So, if you want that the students to collect, for example, you want them to collect the leaves, different kinds of leaves. So, you want to collect them by color or no, by shape. You want them to collect by shape. So, they will be collecting only the shape. So, they will not be confused since kaning a basic science process, as I have said, usually used in the elementary students. So what are the advantages in developing the skill? So making it easy to look for them when needed, of course. Then a neat and properly arranged room speaks for a systematic and disciplined group of students. So diba, since they know how to classify, so they now can clean and they can now make the classroom neat. So, since makita nila ang neatness sa room, so meaning, disiplinado na sila ng students because they know how to classify things in order. In an orderly learning environment is pleasant, safe, and joy to stay in. So, di ba, kung gubot kaayo ang room, kung gubot kay environment, the students cannot learn. And then, fourth is a systematic habits of work. So, since they know how to classify things, they will arrange things. So, systematic ilang habit of work. So, they know how to arrange what work to be done and what works that kanang ilahapang what works, of course, what works to be done and to pass. So now, since they are disciplined enough na and know how to classify things in order. So fifth is easy to analyze and interpret the data collected. So of course, since they classify, they arrange the things in order, the data in order, so they now can easily analyze and interpret the data collected. Unlike sa kanang dili jud sila kabalo mo classify, so those data will be kanang mas scattered siya everywhere. So they do not know na dayon how to analyze the data they have gathered. So that's for the science process skill, which is the classifying. So now for next is the measuring. So for measuring, it is a process of comparing a known quantity to a standard. So timbangon based on its standard. So done. So how to develop the skill of measuring? So first is to consistently require students to quantify their answers about measurable materials to be used until the habit is formed. So kanang consistently require students to quantify their answers. So for example, okay, the students, you have given them problem solving. So the students must use the unit of meter as to kanang ilahang gisukod ang unsa kataas. So ang ilahang i-answer should be meters or centimeters para naadyoy unit standards in measuring. So second is the hard measurements often result to inaccurate data. So dapat step by step and dapat dili paspas gini pagkakuha sa pagsukod. Because if you are in a hurry, those measurements often result in inaccurate data. Like round off lang. So it should be the exact amount, the exact length, the exact kilograms, the exact weight of that object. So para dili sila makakuha og inaccurate nga data. So for third is that measuring unit must be appropriate. So for example, if you want them to measure the length, the unit must be meters, centimeters, and the inches. So you will not use the kilogram, the liters, to avoid the confusion of the students. So fourth is to provide sufficient practice in common measurement instruments. Of course, kanang ipa-practice ni masla to measure. Okay, some usahay ang mga bata man jud, ang mga students man jud will be confused. Sa asa ni siya, sa unsa ni siya dapat. See, instead of kanang centimeter ang ilahang i-measure, dito sila naka-measure sa inches. So they must practice in using the common measuring instruments. So example, ang pinaka-common na gina-measure is the meter stick, the tape measure. So they must practice in how to use that measurements. And fifth is always emphasize the importance of accurate measurements in order to avoid the wasted of materials. Of course. So, di ba, kung sa experiment, we need to have the accurate measurements. So, dapat dili magsubra. Kaya kung magsubra, ma-waste ang atong materials, hindi din siya pwede ibalik. So, always jud i-emphasize ang importance to have that accurate measurements. So now, we go on to the advantages in developing the skill of measuring. So first is that skill in measuring ensures accurate results in an experiment. Of course, since kung accurate ang imuhang measurement, ang accurate ang imuhang object nga gitimbang, so ma-ensure nato nga accurate ang ihang results sa atong experiments. Then, second is quantifying observations facilitate analysis and interpretation of data. So, since we measure that data and we measure that object, or we measure some specific characteristic of the object, then we can quantify the data kung unsang iyang differences sa iyang results. And then students develop the values of preciseness, care, and authenticity. So, diba, since we always emphasize the importance of accurate measurement, so they will now develop the values of preciseness. So, kailangan i-develop nila ang ilahang skill nga kailangan sakto jud ang ilahang gina-measure always. Dilis lang pataka, dilis lang mag-round off, run off, and they will use the accurate measuring unit. And then fourth is a wasted time, effort, and expensive materials are avoided if students stick to accurate measurements. Yes. So, if the students know how to measure things, how to calculate, how to measure things nga ilahang needed lang. So, dili na ta maka-waste sa time sa measure again. And then, di po tayo maka-waste sa atong effort and expensive materials, diba? Kaya kung sobrang atong materials, dili na to siya magamit, and then it will be wasted na. Sabi na akong mga expensive materials. Diba? To avoid that, so, the advantage of the skill of measuring is that the students will stick to accurate measurement. And fifth is the habits of study and work are developed if the students are skilled in measuring. So since the students are skilled na in measuring, so the habits of study and work, so they can now know how to balance their work and study. That is the most important advantage of the skill of measuring. So, the time management. They can now make a time management, so they know how to measure how much time I will pila ka time akong i-google ani nga activity. Pila ka time akong idula, pila ka time akong i laglaag, for example, so that they can now balance their study and their work if they really develop the skill of measuring. So we now proceed to the integrated science processes which usually used in high school students. So first is the inferring. So we know already that inferring is the interpretation or a tentative conclusion based on observation. Tentative conclusion lang siya. That is based on our observations. So, how to develop the skill of inferring? Then, first is to provide more practice in inferring or to sharpen the reasoning ability. So, diba, since tentative conclusion or interpretation based on the data, to provide more practice on inferring to sharpen the reasoning ability. So, they can now infer some data that they have observed. So, kailangan ipa-practice lang siya to develop that skill. And then, second is to caution them in forming ideas only after gathering enough observations that were thoroughly analyzed. So, of course, kailangan mag-infer ka, kailangan based on your observation and that observation at that data that you have, that gi-base nimo should be precise and accurate. So, dapat accurate gid siya to form any ideas. So, after that, ensure na mo nga accurate ang imong data, then you can infer. You can interpret and make a tentative conclusion. So, for third is a problem solving that calls for tentative conclusions can develop the skill in the long run. So, since the problem solving, diba, they know how to make interpretation at tentative conclusions then so if they will do it, so they can develop that skill sa kadugay-dugayon. Yes, they can develop that to make conclusions on what they have observed based on what they have observed. So kailangan accurate gid ang data nga ilang gi-observe, so they can develop that in the long run. So what are the advantages in developing the skill of inferring? First is that the skill can lead them into investigations following the scientific method. So of course, that skill of inferring interpretations or tentative conclusion, it can lead them. So now they have the tentative conclusion. It can lead them into investigations. Kung mag-conclude sila nga, for example, based on their observation nga, not all leaves are colored green. So that investigation can lead to following the scientific method to kung ilahang i-prove nga tinuod jud nga ang mga dahon kay dili tanan colored green. So they will now gather the data for it. So second advantage of developing the skill of inferring is inferring can enhance their reasoning ability. Yes, since diba mag-practice sila and based on what they have observed, they will interpret and make a tentative conclusion. So in the long run, they can enhance their reasoning ability. And then third is that they will be motivated to gather more observations in order to form correct inferences. So diba since kanang ingon sila nag-infer na sila na ang not all leaves colored green. So to really prove that, they will gather more data. So what are the different colors pala of the leaves? So in order to form the correct inferences, they will collect more data, collect more data. For example, collect more other colors of these leaves to prove na dili gitanan leaves green. So next integrated science process is the predicting. So what is the skill of predicting? It is a process of making a forecast based on observed events. So how to develop the skill of predicting? So predict sa imuhang gi-forecast nga mo na siya that will be the result of what have we observed. So for example, so how to develop the skill of predicting? So first is that record the observation in the form of graphs or tabulations where students can see a trend or a pattern. Yes. So diba sa leaves, although it will be used in high school. So, for example, sa leaves. So, record observation in forms of graphs or tabulation. Gitabulate nila na kani siya nga kahoy, you will make different these colors sa leaves. Kani siya nga kahoy. May ilang gitabulate ang ilahang gathered data based on what they have observed. So, they can now see the trend or pattern through recording the observations. So how to? They will now predict that the data gathered that they have proven that not all leaves are green. So second is to provide experiences in making forecasts about events in the environment that are controlled by time, measuring equipment, and price. Yes. Provide experience making, for example, sa kanang we have forecast. For example, sa ulan, if let the students share their experiences sa ulan. If hina yung ulan, di ba, makaingon ta, dili siya mabaha, pag kusog mabaha siya, and there are collateral damages of it. So, provide experiences in making forecasts. So, let them experience the forecast. So, i-may forecast ta kung pila ka meters, kung pila ka kusgon sa ulan nga makakos gid siya og baha. So that will be some environment that are controlled by time, measuring equipment, and price. And the data, they can gather the data through searching the internet and through parang i-incorporate nimo through the information of UST Pag-asa. And then third is to emphasize that there may be several variables that can affect the predicted event. Hence, the prediction will not be accurate. So, emphasize, yes, some variables. Imo jud na siya ikuan sa ilaha sa students, i-emphasize sa students that na mga variables na can affect the predictive. So, example, kanang variables nga, ingon sila nga, kusog kayong ulan, pero nga nung wala siya nagbaha. So, na mga variables na that affect the predicted event. So, hence, the prediction will not be accurate at all. So, fourth, and how to develop this skill is to caution them on making predictions beyond observed events because the same result cannot be guaranteed. Like, for number 3, nag-emphasize ni mo nga there are several variables that can affect the predicted events. So, caution them na naay mga variables pala that beyond on our observations na instead makakuha tag same result of our predictions, dili accurate ang atong predictions. Ang our result cannot be guaranteed nga same siya. So, what are the advantages in developing the skills of predicting? So, first is that students become more careful in making forecasts. Otherwise, they will be turned out to be the guesses. So, dapat ang ilahang forecast will be based on what they have observed and those several variables that can predict that can affect the predicted events. Kaya diba, kung mag-guess lang sila, then it will not be a scientific predicting, a scientific process. It will just be guesses lang. Wala lang, na-guess lang nila. So, second is that skills in predicting speaks of a scientific mind. Yes. Diba, you will be observing something, some events, and then you will forecast based on what you have observed on that event. So, to skill in predicting speaks the scientific mind, a scientific process. Then, third is this is a guarantee that the students will always be confident in following the scientific method. So, since para their guesses, their predictions will not turn out to be just guesses, guesses, parang wala lang. So, this is guarantee that the skill, that their predicting skills in the long run will make them confident in following the scientific method para insakto accurate ang ilahang predictions. Of course, they know what are the variables that can affect the predicted event. And then, fourth is a constant practice in predicting makes a student sticks to accurate measurements, data, and other information. Yes. So, let's proceed to another integrated science process, which is the controlling the variables. So, controlling variables. So, control the factor or condition, the effect of which is being tested. So, murang yung variables. So, how to develop the skill of controlling the variables? First is to identify clearly the variable to be changed. Yes. Identify nimo unsa gid imo ang i-change nga variable. Then, second is be strict with keeping the rest of the condition the same. Yes, dapat may controlled group na pud ang mga variables nga imong gi-change to see that, diba, since nag-predict na ka nga mauni, if mauni siya, then mauna siya ang result, then be strict in keeping the rest of the conditions the same to see if kanang naa ba siya pattern, if naa ba siya related results based on your predictions. And naa ba siya in relation to the result that is based on your predictions. Diba, since gikip lang nimo ang rest of the variables to the same condition. So, third is that they will be trained in searching for cause and effect in some condition in the environment. So, diba, ma-develop nila ang cause and effect. So, mingus lang nga, if kusog ang ulan, then it will cause flood. Diba? they will train in searching the cause and effect. So there are some variables sa yun nga nung if ever kusog ang ulan dili magbaha. Cause na good nga drainage system ang kanang lugar. So they will be trained in searching for the cause and effect in some condition in the environment. And then how to arrive, they know how to arrive at correct conclusions must be objective. So, di ba, kung imuhang conclusions, imuha lang gitumuan, it's not based on what you have observed, then it will point as a guess lang. It should be correct conclusions. It must be objective. It must be based on your observation. And what are the advantages in developing the skill? So first, the students become skilled in searching for a reliable evidence before formulating a conclusion. So, diba, they know how to control the variables. So, they will become skilled in searching for reliable evidence. Nga katong mga evidences na wala na alter. Two, before formulating a conclusion. Second is the training on how to design on experiment and is developed. And third, such controlled set enables students to follow the scientific method. And then we have the interpreting data. So interpreting data collected, analyzed thoroughly in order to arrive at a clear and reliable conclusion. So how to develop the skill of interpreting data? So train them in presenting data through various illustration. So, di ba, to interpret the data, they know how to collect the data. So, and then after collecting, they will be presenting the data through various illustration, through graphs or through illustration that they will use to present. And then let them interpret different kinds of relationship between relevant and irrelevant data. So, the students will should know how to interpret different kinds of relationships sa relevant nga data. So, para ni siya ani nga data, and kani siya, dili ni siya ngayon ani nga research, dili siya ngayon ani nga study. Irrelevant ni siya nga data for this study. So, they should know how to interpret different kinds of relationship between this data. Then, third is an objective and unbiased interpretation from part of their study and work habits. So, di ba, it needs science process should be objective and not biased. Kaya di ba, pag once nga subjective ang imuhang interpretation, then it is not a good study. It is you will yield a not good result because subjective sometimes are irrelevant data. Then, what are the advantages in developing the skill of interpreting the data? So, the students become skilled in determining relationships between variables. A proficiency must needed in interpreting the results. And then second is that observation will be definitely enable them to follow the steps of the scientific method. And third is a proficiency in interpreting the data. Observations will be developed. So they will now develop the skill on how to gather and interpret the accuracy of the data and they can know the conclusion, the accurate conclusion, and they can formulate accurate conclusions. So next is the experimenting. So experimenting is the final test that requires competence in science processes, especially controlling the variables, interpreting the data, and formulating hypotheses. And how to develop the skill of experimenting. So first is that making every learning activity problem-based and solution-oriented is ideal in science course. So, diba, since you will experiment, so it should be a problem-based. And then, of course, since it is a problem, dapat nasa siya solution. It is an ideal science process. Then second is consistent guidance in following the procedures is recommended. So, di ba? Pag experiment, there should be instructions. There should be step-by-step process that is given to that student. So, and the students need a consistent guidance to follow that procedures to make a kanang accurate results of their experiments. And third is that involve the students in planning and implementing the design setup. So you should involve them. For example, um, you will let them to decide on what are the setups, what are the materials they will use to to implement that experiment. And fourth is the revision in some steps in the procedures may be allowed in order to enhance their creativity in finding appropriate answers to everyday inquiries. So, some of the procedures can be revised instead of following all of it, basta kay maka-produce gihapon sila og accurate nga result. So, what are the advantages in developing the skill of experimenting? So, first is a scientific mind that has cultivated a scientific methodology is definitely one of the best goals in science teaching. Of course, so muna siyang advantage in experimenting. The students have this scientific mind that can cultivate scientific methods. The next advantage in developing the skill of experimenting is that the skill experimenting has a lasting effect on how they approach their learning activity. So, gamit na gamit nila ang experimenting skill sa ilahang other learning activities. And then, third is that they learn how to manage their own life problem-wise. So, di ba? If they have a problem, they will use the scientific methods for them to find solution. For them, they will gather data. Magamit gid nila nga skill of experimenting. So we'll now proceed to the scientific method. So we have 6 processes of the scientific method that is discussed here. So we have first is the identifying the problem. So we identify the problem, so we ask question. For example, why does Greenland look so large on the map? So nga naman, and then we proceed to formulating a tentative solution. So now for our background research, then we learn that Greenland is a quarter the size of the United States in land mass. And then, after formulating a tentative solution, then choosing the likely hypothesis. So, we chose the likely hypothesis. So, our hypothesis here is that if we make a Mercator projection map, then the items in the middle of the map will look their true size and the items at the poles will look larger than they really are. So, the Mercator projection map is katong pa-curve siya, pa-circular. And then, after choosing the likely hypothesis, let's move to the next step, which is testing the hypothesis. So, we will do an experiment. Then, we will use a sphere with 1 inch and 1 inch squares at each pole and the equator to make a Mercator projection map. And then next, after we test the hypothesis, of course, we will collect, record, and analyze the data. So, recording and analyzing data. So we have the analyzed data that the middle of the map squares average 1 inch per side, while the squares at the poles average 3 inches per side. So now, that's for our data that we analyze. Then, after that, we now formulate the conclusion. So, we make the conclusion based on our data we observe. So, our conclusion that in conclusion, the projection process used to make Mercator projection maps creates distortion at the poles and then but not at the equator. This is why Greenland, which is close to the North Pole, looks larger than it is. So, we now answer our problem, which is why does the Greenland look so large at the map? So it is because Greenland, which is close to the North Pole, looks larger than it is because the projection process used to make Mercator projection maps creates distortion at the poles. So to sum it up, we learned the basic science process and the integrated science process skills. So for basic science process, we have observing a process wherein we react by our five senses. Comparing, the ability to recognize the similarities and differences of the things being observed, the classifying, the measuring. And for integrated science process, we have the inferring, the predicting, the controlling the variables, the interpreting the data, the drawing conclusions and generalization, and lastly, the final test of our skills is the experimenting. So that is all for today's video. I hope you learned something from me and thank you for watching.